I remember the first time I stepped foot in Salem. It felt like I was walking through a place trapped in time. The cold air, the dampness in the earth beneath me, the haunting silence that seemed to wrap itself around every corner. It was as if the spirits of the past were still lingering, whispering secrets no one dared to uncover. My name is Sarah, and I've always been fascinated by the supernatural, maybe too fascinated. It was the only reason I'd ever want to visit a place so infamous, a place haunted not only by its history, but by the ghosts of those who never found peace. It wasn't long before I found myself standing in front of the infamous Salem courthouse, the very building where many innocent souls were condemned to their death. The air seemed thicker here, heavier, as if the weight of centuries of guilt hung on every brick. I could almost hear their voices, soft, pleading, desperate. I shook off the eerie thought and tried to focus, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This place, it was alive with something darker. Something that wanted to be felt. Or perhaps feared. As I walked further into the town, my eyes were drawn to the old homes, wooden and twisted, as if they too were hiding something. The windows stared at me like unblinking eyes. I had come for a tour, just like any other curious visitor, but what I found that day, it wasn't a tour at all. It was something far worse. Something I would come to regret. The town of Salem wasn't just haunted by history, it was haunted by something else, something that had been born in the hysteria, the fear, and the unexplainable events that took place centuries ago. I didn't expect much, certainly not what happened next. I stood there, my breath clouding in front of me, and a strange chill ran through my body. It wasn't just the cold. It was something else. Something wrong. And then I saw it. A figure, draped in black, moving swiftly through the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was a person, perhaps someone on a tour, but no one else seemed to be around. It wasn't a person at all. It was something else entirely. I took a step forward, my heart racing. The figure turned, and I swear I saw its eyes. They were not human. They were dark, empty, and full of something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure vanished into the darkness, and just as quickly as it appeared, I found myself alone again. No one had seen it. No one had heard it. But I had. I could still feel its presence, lingering in the very air around me. The rest of the night was a blur. I wandered through the streets, the sounds of footsteps behind me echoing like whispers. I knew I wasn't alone, but when I turned, nothing was there. The silence was deafening, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, and too close for comfort. Help me. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The voice seemed to echo through the empty streets, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My mind raced, my heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just the ghosts of Salem's past I had to worry about. Something had followed me. Something that shouldn't have been. And it was only the beginning. The sound of the voice began to morph, twisting into something darker, more frantic. I tried to scream, but my throat went dry, my body frozen in place. The town itself seemed to be alive, shifting, warping in the darkness. The shadows twisted into forms that shouldn't have been possible. People, faces, eyes that stared back at me, unblinking, filled with centuries of hatred. I wanted to run, but the ground beneath me felt like it was pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the nightmare. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I stumbled, tripping over my own feet as I tried to escape, but the streets kept twisting, leading me back to the same place. The same dark figure appeared, and this time it was closer. So close that I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, only to find nothing but the oppressive silence that smothered everything around me. And then I saw it. A figure in the distance, walking slowly toward me. It was a woman. No, not a woman, not entirely. Her face was hollow, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She wore a tattered dress that swirled around her legs as she moved, as if she were floating. Her hair was long and black, hanging limp around her face. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. No sound came out, but the terror in her eyes was enough to freeze me in place. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. She stepped closer, and I could feel the air grow colder with each step. I could almost hear the faintest whispers, the words of the dead who had been condemned all those years ago. Words of anger, betrayal, and sorrow. Their spirits had never found peace, and now they were reaching out, pulling me into their web. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the briefest moment, I felt her pain. I felt the weight of centuries of fear and injustice, all of it boiling over into something that could no longer be contained. The air around me thickened, suffocating me with its pressure. And then, nothing. Silence. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The street was empty once more. But I knew it wasn't over. The spirits of Salem weren't finished with me. They were just getting started. And the worst part was, nothing about this was just in my head. This was real. The rest of the night passed in a blur, my mind too fractured to make sense of anything. I tried to leave, tried to get away from that cursed place, but every street I took seemed to lead me back to the same spot. The darkness was alive, pulsating, wrapping its cold fingers around my thoughts, my very soul. It felt as if Salem itself were a trap, and I had walked right into it. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled upon the old cemetery, the one everyone whispered about. The place where the dead of Salem were buried. Or at least, where the bodies were supposed to be laid to rest. But nothing stays buried forever, especially in a town with a history like this. As I stood there, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the smell of earth and decay. It felt like the graves were calling to me, urging me to come closer. And so I did. I stepped past the weathered tombstones, the names barely legible, the stones cracked and broken. And that's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I could barely hear it at first. But it was there, curling around me like a snake. "You should not have come here," it hissed. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the air. From the shadows, figures began to appear, twisted, malformed shapes that seemed to shift with the wind. Their faces, or what was left of them, were contorted in agony, their eyes hollow and dark. They were the spirits of the accused, those who had been wrongfully put to death in the name of witchcraft, the ones who had been forgotten by time, but not by the curse that Salem had become. They reached for me, their cold hands brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of icy terror through my body. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The air thickened, the pressure on my chest unbearable, as if the entire cemetery were closing in on me, suffocating me with its centuries of rage. I could see their faces, their eyes, so many souls trapped in limbo, bound to this cursed place, never allowed to rest. I didn't know how long I was there, or if I had even truly left. But when I finally managed to stagger out of the cemetery, the world seemed different, darker. The whispers of Salem followed me, lingering just beyond my reach, teasing me with the promises of more secrets waiting to be uncovered. But I knew better. Some things should never be unearthed. Some spirits should never be disturbed. As I made my way back to the town center, the figure appeared again. The woman with hollow eyes and tattered dress. She was waiting for me, just outside the town square, as if she had been expecting me all along. She took a step toward me, and her mouth opened, but this time, a voice came through, a voice that wasn't her own. "Your journey has just begun," it whispered, as if the town itself were speaking. "You will never leave Salem, not truly. We have claimed you, just as we claimed them." And then, the world went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, or if I had truly passed out at all. It felt like time itself had folded in on me. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer standing in the streets of Salem, but lying on cold, damp ground. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint scent of decayed wood and earth clung to my skin. I could barely make out the shadows around me, flickering in the dim light as if they were alive, shifting. Was I dreaming? No. The pressure in the air felt too real, too suffocating. The whispers that had haunted me earlier now felt like they were closing in. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. Something was wrong. The ground felt strange, too soft beneath my feet. Like I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. I looked down, but there was nothing but a dark, swirling mist, thick enough to obscure everything except my own hands. I reached for something to steady myself, but my fingers brushed against something wet. Something wrong. I pulled my hand away in disgust, but when I looked at my palm, it was slick with a dark, sticky substance, blood. But not just blood. It smelled of decay, of something older, far older than any of the bodies buried in the ground. I could hear the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then the sound grew louder, sharper. And then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it, a figure, standing motionless in the mist. It was a silhouette at first, but as I blinked, it became clearer, more solid. A man. No, not just any man. A man in rags, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken so deep into his skull that they barely looked like eyes at all. His lips were cracked and dry, a grotesque mockery of a smile stretched across his face. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. His gaze was fixed on me, burning through me as if he could see all my secrets, all my fears. I could feel his cold presence pressing against me, like a vice on my chest, suffocating me. He stepped forward, and with every movement, the mist seemed to grow thicker, wrapping itself around me like chains, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My thoughts were drowning in the crushing weight of his gaze. "Do you know where you are?" His voice was barely a whisper, a rasping sound that seemed to come from the very air around me. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but somehow it felt familiar. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I couldn't find my voice. My body was frozen, locked in place, my mind screaming for release. The figure took another step closer, and I could see the sharpness of his features, the way his skin seemed to hang from his bones, stretched thin by the weight of time. His mouth opened wider, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. They looked like they could tear through flesh like paper. He reached out, a bony hand extending toward me, his fingers impossibly long, reaching, grasping. I wanted to step back, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the mist itself held me in place, like invisible hands were gripping my ankles. His hand hovered just inches from my face, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, an unnatural chill that sank deep into my bones. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his breath colder than the air around us. "You have disturbed the dead. And the dead do not forget." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, The fog cleared for a brief moment. I saw the cemetery again, but this time it was different. The tombstones were crooked, leaning, and the ground seemed to pulse as if something beneath it was alive. The dead were restless here, still chained to the earth, still longing for the vengeance they never got in life. And somehow, I had awakened them. Before I could process the thought, the figure's hand shot forward, grabbing my wrist with a strength that was impossible for someone in his condition. His fingers dug into my skin, icy cold and unyielding, sending jolts of pain through my arm. I tried to pull away, but it was like trying to escape the grip of the earth itself. His eyes bore into mine, and for a moment, I saw something terrible. It was like a vision, a flash of history, rushing through me, overwhelming me. I saw the Salem Witch Trials, young girls in tattered clothes, screaming accusations, their eyes wild with fear and madness. I saw women, innocent women, being dragged to the gallows, their faces twisted in terror as they were hanged for crimes they didn't commit. The figure's voice echoed in my mind, his words haunting and unrelenting. "They came for us," he hissed, his breath foul and rancid. We were innocent, but it was the fear that killed us. Fear and hate. And now, we want revenge. I couldn't breathe. The vision faded, and I was back in the cemetery, but everything had changed. The ground shifted beneath my feet, as if the earth itself were alive, shifting and groaning under the weight of centuries of forgotten death. The trees around me began to move, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, their leaves rustling like whispers. And the mist was thickening again, rising higher and higher, swallowing everything in its path. I looked around, frantic now, trying to find something, anything, to help me break free from this nightmare. But there was no escape. The cemetery was vast, too vast, stretching on in every direction, the tombstones stretching higher and higher, disappearing into the fog. And then I heard it, a sound, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a chanting, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come from the very earth beneath my feet. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, so dark, so ancient, sent a shiver down my spine. It was the sound of a ritual, of something being summoned from the depths of the earth, something older than time itself. My heart raced, my breath shallow, as I spun around, searching for the source of the noise. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, standing at the foot of a massive oak tree, was a figure. No, not just a figure, several figures. They were hooded, their faces obscured by dark cloaks, their movements synchronized in a slow, deliberate motion. They raised their hands toward the sky, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The earth shook with a deafening roar, as if the very foundations of the world were being ripped apart. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the wind picked up, whipping around me, pulling at my clothes and hair. I tried to move, to run, but my legs were leaden, weighed down by the oppressive force of whatever was happening here. The mist seemed to swirl around me, pulling me toward the figures. My body felt heavy, sluggish, like I was being dragged against my will, inch by inch, toward the center of the ritual. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw her. The woman from before, the one with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. She was there, standing among the cloaked figures, her mouth stretched in a silent scream. Her eyes met mine, and this time, there was no sympathy. No pity. Only the cold, unfeeling gaze of something that had seen too much death, too much pain, to care anymore. And then, as if on cue, the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening, absolute. The figures lowered their arms, and the wind died down. I could barely hear my own breathing over the thundering of my heart. And then, the woman spoke. "You've awakened us," she said, her voice cold, distant. You've given us the power to finish what was started. We were wronged, and now we take what is ours." Her words echoed in my mind like a death sentence, and I felt a surge of panic. I had to get out. I had to escape before it was too late. But the ground beneath me was no longer solid. The mist was rising higher, swallowing everything around me. The faces of the dead appeared in the fog, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The figures in the distance were moving again, their chanting starting once more. The woman's eyes locked onto mine one last time. "You will never leave," she whispered, her voice like ice. And then, the earth cracked open beneath me, and I fell into the darkness.